So now we're going to look at some of the congressional powers in detail, specifically the Commerce Clause. And what I'd like to do is kind of start out first with like just an anticipation guide. So as you're watching this, just mentally make a judgment. Is this a true statement or a false statement? So the power to regulate trade helped justify the Civil Rights Voting Act of 1964. The power to regulate trade helped to justify the Civil Rights Voting Act of 1964. True or false? Congress can regulate anything. Congress's power is unlimited. And so kind of keep that in mind as we move back through this. What I'd like to do is let's first talk a little bit about congressional powers. Now we've already seen a bunch of these. We saw this in the last lecture, but you can see Congress has the power to tax, to borrow money, to regulate commerce. So maybe what we need to do is understand, what does regulate mean? And regulate essentially means to control, whether it means to expand or to limit it or to put limitations on it. To allow people to act freely or to act under a sort of limited, what do I want to say, a limited area of operations. So coin and regulate, right? So the Congress has the power to coin money. We've talked about that. Regulate bankruptcy. Congress has the power for foreign relations or war powers or naturalization. So essentially, Congress has the power to regulate our borders, right? It would be illogical for Congress to, or for like the state of Arizona to control its borders. That's not Arizona's responsibility. That's the national government's responsibility. It also has the power of the postal power and copyrights and patents. What Congress cannot do, and this is important as well, so sometimes it's a lot easier to understand what it cannot do as opposed to what it can. It cannot establish a national public school system. What it can do is it can essentially regulate, or it can't really even regulate. What it does, it can set parameters on national achievement, and it does it basically through money. I said early on, what I tell my classroom students quite a bit is, if you don't know the answer, it usually has to do with money. So how can Congress control our schools, our state schools? Well, they do that through money. So they can say, hey, you are going to follow these directives or you're not going to get any money. It's kind of the carrot, trying to motivate. It cannot require people to vote. It cannot require attendance to church. We have a separation of church and state to a limited degree. It cannot set a minimum age for marriage. Each state has that right. Remember, that is the 10th Amendment that says any powers that have not essentially been stated here are reserved to the states. So each state has the power to set minimum age for marriage. Indiana has a law that says 16 years old with parent consent. In some states, it can be even lower. Congress cannot set a minimum age for driver's licenses. For example, Indiana, it's 16, and actually it's begun to kind of creep up a little bit. It's getting closer to 17 now. But states like Wyoming, where there's no like state infrastructure, there's no busing between cities that's as developed as it is even in Indiana, although ours is pretty bad. You can have a provisional driver's license at the age of 14 in Wyoming. Congress cannot abolish juries or confiscate handguns or censor newspaper columns or television or radio broadcasts. So there's a lot of things that Congress cannot do. If we look specifically at some of the powers of the House, there we go, I'm bringing that down a little bit. One of the things that we can see is that Congress has the power to raise revenue through taxes, and this is called appropriation, right? So they have to create like a law that authorizes money to be paid from the essentially, anytime Congress raises money or spends money, they have to create a law to do so. They just can't randomly do it. And you can just kind of see this is our federal spending, our national budget in the year 2011, and all the money we see is in billions. But this is where our money goes. This is where Congress actually spends its money. Our current budget is around $3.5 trillion. This was in 2011. We're now in 2015. I think it's closer to $4 billion now. But you can see we spend 700 billion for defense. We spend 725 billion for Social Security. We spend 835 billion for Medicare and Medicaid. This is what Obamacare's the Affordable Care Act. This is what he tried to address. This is the fastest growing segment of our budget. We pay interest yearly, about $227 billion in interest. If you've ever borrowed money, you know that that's a lot of money. We also have some discretionary, which means we have some choice, but most of these are all mandatory. So this is just kind of give you an idea of where Congress's money or where our money goes. Some other powers of the House include the powers of impeachment. Now, the number one thing that people get confused about is they think impeachment is the end game, and really impeachment is just the beginning. So Congress, and specifically the House, has the power to bring charges against an executive official. We most notably think about the president, but other executive officers can be removed as well. So it's up to Congress to bring the charges. Then it's up to the Senate to try it, and the Supreme Court essentially acts as the judge. So that kind of gives you an idea a little bit. We've had 2 presidents that have been impeached. Both of them have been acquitted. So all that means is there has been enough evidence to bring them to trial. If you remember William Clinton or Bill Clinton, he essentially lied under oath. Perjury is considered a very, very important, I guess. We expect our leaders to tell the truth when under oath, and President Clinton didn't necessarily do that with in regards to his scandal involving activities in the Oval Office. President Andrew Johnson was brought to trial mostly because of the fact that he was a Southerner. He's the president that followed right after Lincoln, and he was a Southerner, and a lot of Northern patriots kind of felt like he was kind of obstructing any sort of relationship that we were to have with the South. Northerners wanted to punish them. Southerners wanted a pretty easy way out. Moving on. So here's some of the powers of the Senate. So the Senate has several exclusive powers, and you could have seen that earlier, but they consent to treaties. They approve treaties. So if President Obama wants to sign a treaty with Iran over nuclear weapons, it's the Senate that gets the job to be able to approve it or not approve it. They also consent or confirm appointments to, like, the executive branch. So, for example, to become Secretary of the Department of Defense, the Senate gets to approve it. If, for example, a judge like Obama gets an opportunity to appoint a new Supreme Court justice, the Senate then gets the opportunity to confirm or consent to it. They also, as we see, get to judge a trial of federal officials impeached by the House. The Senate is a much more deliberative and more prestigious body, and mostly due to the fact that they have longer terms, there's fewer of them, and they tend to represent a much greater section of society. They essentially represent their state, as opposed to a congressman or a House member that just represents his district. The Senate is sometimes called the world's greatest deliberative body, and that's mostly because they have the ability to filibuster. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that Congress has the power to override a presidential veto. So let's say Congress passes a law that says we're going to change the name of Monday to Moon Day. I don't know, something really simple. So what Congress would be able, and the president then vetoes that because he's pretty tight with Monday. Sorry, my phone. He's pretty tight with Monday. He doesn't want to change it, so he vetoes it. Well, Congress can ultimately check the power of the president in a 2/3 majority vote. They can ultimately override it. Okay. So as you can see, though, there hasn't been many vetoes that have been overridden by Congress. Only 106 out of 1,400 presidential vetoes were ever overridden. So it's a fairly rare thing. As far as pocket veto goes, we'll talk about that more by a president. But essentially, a president can kind of put a bill in his pocket, and once Congress is adjourned, essentially he can just let it veto. We'll move on here. Now, what we're going to talk about here is the power to regulate commerce, because this is kind of one of those powers that really Congress has kind of expanded its scope. So what is the Commerce Clause? So in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, it states that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So the idea here is okay, so Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, between the states, and with the Indian tribes. Now, what does that really mean? And actually, Chief Justice John Marshall in 1824 said this: few things were better known than the immediate causes which led to the adoption of the present Constitution. So he's actually saying this is the real reason we wrote a new Constitution and got rid of the Articles, that the prevailing motive was to regulate commerce, to rescue it from the embarrassing and destructive consequences resulting from the legislation of so many different states, and to place it under the protection of uniform law. So one state cannot impose like trade restrictions on another state. Indiana wants to sell its corn to Maryland. Ohio cannot say that you have to pay a tax when Indiana corn goes through the state to get to Maryland. Ohio cannot do that. So it's pretty important clause here. Now, why is the Commerce Clause so important? Well, what it says is it's arguably the most important because it is the means by which Congress is able to legislate in areas that would otherwise be left to the states to decide. So Congress gets to be the one to determine how these issues are taken care of. Now, what can Congress do? So Congress can regulate channels of interstate commerce, including highways, waterways, air traffic. Congress can regulate people, machines, and other things used in carrying out commerce. Congress can regulate things moving in interstate commerce, right, between the states. And Congress can regulate commercial activities that have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. For example, Congress can regulate the size of tires. Why? Because tires, once cars or trucks move between states, we can't have different, tire grades. We can't have different widths between the axles. So Congress regulates that. Now, what we're going to do, one of our assignments we're going to look at is we're going to specifically look at these three and see how the Commerce Clause has been interpreted. We'll first look at Gibbons versus Ogden. This is the first real interpretation of the Commerce Clause. But that's kind of where we're going to go. So let's go back to our initial, I should pull this up, our initial true-false. Civil rights. Congress used the Commerce Clause to regulate civil rights. Yes, they did. Because you think about the first, people sat in at lunch counters in Greensboro. That's commerce. It can be used against sex offenders. I'm running out of time, so I need to kind of hurry here. But it's really important to kind of understand that commerce can be used in a multitude of ways. So that kind of brings us to the end. Can Congress, does it have unlimited power? No, it doesn't, because the president has a veto.